to kick off.
Okay, hello everyone. For the people I can see, nice to see you, and welcome to those who I can't see. Just to say on behalf of Pavee Point, the thanks to Ciara and her colleagues for this opportunity to speak to the International Association of Community Development. A little bit about our work, the core values and principles which inform the work of Pavee Point in terms of our work with Travers and Roma. And then obviously we'll talk more specifically about our research guidelines that we recently launched there in, I think, December, maybe, in Maynooth College as part of the John O'Connell Award Initiative, which is very much about adopting an ethical, inclusive and respectful approach to research being undertaken with Travers and Roma. So myself and Lynsey have kind of divvied up some of the slides between us, but we will also interject where appropriate when we're speaking to each other's slides. So to give you a little bit about the guidelines weren't developed in a vacuum, obviously. There is a bit of a context to the rationale behind them. And when I talk a little bit about Pavee Point, some of that rationale I think might become self-evident. If not, then we'll come back to it. But as Ciara says, the organisation was established in 1985. And it brought to the table a very unique and innovative analysis at the time around Travers and more recently a Roma in terms of human rights approaches to the work. People must understand that there is obviously a long history before 1985 in terms of the work and the very problematic approach to the work with Travers, which was actually very racist in nature. It very much revolved around policies of assimilation, absorbing Travers into the settled community, no acknowledgement of cultural rights, the right to one's identity, the right to one's language, and for that to be supported and validated by the state. There was no acknowledgement that the collective experience of Travers was one of racism, both institutional racism and individual racism. So that was the history really from the 60s, you could say, with that very seminal report called the Commission on Itinerancy, which was published in 1963. So that was the analysis and understanding in terms of the approach to the work with Travers, right up until 1985, when that racist analysis was challenged by people like the late John O'Connell, Lord rest him, Ronnie Faye, Lord rest her, Anastasia Quigley, and indeed many others. So we, the analysis we very much is revolved around human rights. We're looking at Travers and Roma issues through a human rights lens, not one of destitution, poverty, and dealing with symptoms, but it's dealing with underlying and root causes, which I said is one of racism, exclusion, inequality, cultural denial, poor educational attainment, high unemployment, and we'll come to those later on. So the organisation is a partnership organisation. It's comprised of Travers, non-Travers, and the Roma community working collectively for the attainment and realisation of Travers and Roma human rights across all the spheres, whether it's access to education, employment, healthcare, accommodation, and so forth. So a big part of our work is obviously campaigning and advocacy and trying to influence and shape policy. So whenever government or state agencies and government departments are developing policies, we try to influence and shape those policies insofar as we can to ensure that they are reflective of and inclusive of the needs of Travers and Roma. And at the moment, we're operating within a very rich policy context, but maybe implementation poor. And I think that might be familiar to a lot of people here. So in the last 2 years, there has been a couple of key policy developments. For example, NITRIS, which is the National Travel Roma Inclusion Strategy, which is a whole of government integrated and coordinated approach in addressing travel issues and to avoid any kind of silo approach from various government departments and state agencies. We also have, for the first time ever, the National Travel Roma Education Strategy, which is very much about promoting access, participation and positive outcomes from the education system at all levels, obviously for Travers and Roma. And then we have the National Travel Health Action Plan. And then we also have the TAPS, which is the 5-year travel accommodation programs, obviously dealing with the huge accommodation crisis that both the Travers and the Roma community experience. So Pavee Point was centrally involved in those consultation processes. In fact, to be fair, you could argue there was apart from inclusive community engagement, you could say actually they were co-designed right from the very beginning and the middle and the end in terms of the analysis and the recommendations, which ultimately were arrived at from those policy processes. So we work in solidarity with other marginalised and oppressed groups. We're obviously very clear that Travers and Roma, on their own, uh, we don't have the capacity to affect social change, and it's important that we develop alliances and partnerships with other NGOs, human rights organisations, dealing with issues like the LGBTIQ community, people with disabilities, older people, and indeed many more. So that alliance building, partnership building is important to our work. So we deal with a whole range of issues dealing with health, violence against women. These are programs we have in Pavee Point dealing directly on these issues: drugs and alcohol, arts and culture, education, media, communications, Roma, obviously, health and homelessness. In terms of arts and culture, uh, the aim there is obviously is to try and have Travers much more visible and included in our mainstream institutions. When it comes to Irish history and how Irish history gets recorded, interpreted, and presented, it's often from a settled perspective and from a settled values base. And Travers, as a result, are a mere footnote in Irish history, and that's reflected in our institutions, whether that's in the school curriculum, or whether it's in museums and art galleries. So it's about trying to address that and ensure that we as a community are more included and visible in these spaces. Uh, the organisation works at a local level, national level, and an international level. And in fact, we were the first traveller organisation in the country, if you like, to internationalise, for the want of a better term, the traveller question and issues impacting on travellers. So we engage quite extensively with, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so on. And we feel these mechanisms are really important in terms of putting in shadow reports and getting really important recommendations and concluding observations from these bodies that we then can use at a domestic level in terms of our advocacy and campaigning work to affect social change and positive change for Travellers and Roma. And then lastly, a big part of our a core part of our work is research and developing data, getting evidence to inform policy development and more targeted initiatives, in terms of education, employment, accommodation, and so forth. So, as we've always said in different spaces, when we're negotiating with state agencies and government departments, we go to these meetings with the data, with the evidence, pointing to the inequality and the poor outcomes that Travellers and Roma experience in all different spheres, and it's trying to have that data and that evidence then inform policy and then ultimately policy implementation. So then in terms of the context, I won't go through it all because it's very detailed, but what we can do is we can share the presentation with you afterwards, and we can send it to Kira, and Kira can circulate it if that's okay with people. So anyway, just a little kind of a snippet there. You can see in terms of health, the huge health inequalities that Travellers experience. The infant mortality rate is 4 times higher in our community than it is in the majority population. Suicide rate is 6 times higher in our community than what it is in the majority population. And in fact, suicide constitutes 11% of all deaths in the community. So it's frightening, it's scary, and and there can be a multitude of reasons for that. And we've always adopted the social determinants approach to health, not just purely the medical model. So factors such as poor living conditions, unemployment, low educational attainment, and then of course racism and the impact of racism and internalized oppression, where the community has been oppressed for so long. They've internalized the message that we are inadequate, we are backward, we are inferior to the majority population. And when that becomes internalized, then mental health issues and low self-esteem and lack of confidence begin to manifest themselves, and these are contributing factors to the high suicide rate in our community. Then we move on just very briefly. You can see there, as I said, we have for the first time ever a national travel Roma inclusion strategy to deal with the educational inequalities that travellers experience. And you can see there from the census 2002, just less than 2% of travellers completed third level education. And also you can see that 28% of travellers have left school before the age of 13, compared to 1% of non-travellers. So it points to the stark educational inequalities that the new strategy is aiming to address. Then you have the accommodation crisis. We have about 12,000 travelers, which is about 5,000 families living in what can only be described as squalor and squalor and deprivation, lacking the basic essentials to live any sort of a dignified existence. Lack of access to sanitation, water, electricity, refuse collection, living in unsafe, overcrowded conditions, both on existing official sites. It has to be said, but then also on unofficial sites on the side of the road and so forth. And there is a strategy to try and deal with the accommodation crisis, and that's called the National Travel Accommodation Programs. These are 5-year travel accommodation programs that all 31 local authorities have to adopt and work towards their full implementation over a 5-year period. Again, like other policies, implementation is a bit sporadic and a bit patchy and limited, I would say. And then, anyway, move down. Then you can see the unemployment. There's no need to go through it. It's self-explanatory. I suppose the overall point there to make here is that if it wasn't for ethnic equality data collection, we wouldn't even have these stats. And I think that's the important point to make. And of course, the important point to make that, and Lynsey will reinforce this later on, is that travel and organisations and groups working with Roma, have been centrally involved in that data gathering exercise to ensure that it was done in a very inclusive, ethical and respectful manner. So that's it, I think, Lynsey.
Just the Roma stats.
Yeah, so then you can see there the Roma, again, some of the stats pointing to the inequalities in terms of accommodation, education, employment and health. And one of the biggest issues there, not the only issue, but one of the biggest issues there is the HRC, the habitual residency condition, where a lot of Roma families are having difficulty accessing that because you have to prove an association or tie with the state for a period of time. I think it might be 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. Then you have to have utility bills, which is not really feasible because a lot of Roma families are doubling up in whatever accommodation they might have. It might be an apartment or a flat, and utility bills would be just in the name of whoever, one or two people, but you could have 2 or 3 families actually living in the one space. So it just makes it difficult for Roma, and then that drives them into poverty and then other ways of trying to feed themselves, like begging and so forth, which then in turn is also criminalised. So it's a catch-22 situation. So I don't know if there's much more to add there, as we can send on the PowerPoint to people.
Yeah, and I suppose I'll just pick up there. I think one of the things that we do in Pavee Point, we take a mainstreaming and targeted approach to any of the research or any of the work that we do. So, for instance, all of the data that was just presented, and Martin had presented it, a lot of it is from our national census, which Pavee Point were central and core to getting an ethnicity question alongside other community groups back in 2002, 2006. So we've always taken a mainstreaming and a targeted approach to all of our work, but including research. So any of the kind of national research, that the state is commissioning, we would actively, I suppose, campaign and advocate that travellers and Roma should be included in terms of ethnicity. But then we also undertake more targeted pieces of research depending on emerging issues on the ground. So as an organisation, we commission research directly. We participate and contribute to other commissioned pieces of research by the state or other institutions. And then we're asked increasingly, more than others in the community sector, to participate in interviews or participate in some data collection pieces. So we're very much involved in terms of research. And I suppose one of the key challenges at the moment for us, and I know other colleagues probably on the call, is research fatigue. So we'll talk a bit around that, around the challenges. But in terms of our starting point, and Martin alluded to earlier, what is said, research is one tool, but it's a very useful tool in terms of setting discourse, in terms of setting an analysis, in terms of supporting and informing state policy. So, our starting point is that it's hard enough to do this work, and it's hard enough in terms of travellers and Roma, in terms of trying to ensure that rights and equality are reinforced. without researchers coming along, and I suppose not challenging racism or not using research to challenge racism and indeed enforcing it, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So part of our starting point is that any of the research that we're engaged with should fundamentally address core issues in terms of travellers and Roma and should be used to challenge racism and discrimination, which isn't always easy because often researchers come to us with a set of research questions and their own research agenda. And often we feel, I suppose, challenged in those interactions because we're saying, look, that the research agenda should be set by the community themselves, given emerging issues. Um, so as I said, look, our starting point is how can research be used to challenge racism and discrimination and promote equality and social justice? How can it be used to inform policy, as Martin said, in terms of identifying and challenging structural change and also collective action? And then for us, really, and I think it's more in vogue now and I suppose used quite a bit is how can you do it in partnership? What does partnership look like? Because there's lots of terms that are bandied around PPI, peer research. Like what do they actually mean in practice? And so for us, really, I suppose over the past number of years, we've tried to interrogate those concepts and also putting into practice our own approach and our own methodology to research, which has been crafted over the past 40 years. So really, what does that look like in practice? As I said just before we start, like we can't start to talk about research without addressing those core kind of challenges that we're all challenged with at the moment. So research fatigue, we would say travellers are probably one of the most researched groups in Ireland. And that, I suppose, the trajectory has shifted, whereas research was often inflicted upon travellers, especially from those from outside the country, those in anthropology and other disciplines. And then I suppose with the direct engagement from Pavee Point and other travel organisations, in terms of shaping the research agenda. But there's been a huge amount of research undertaken on and with travellers. A little bit more for Roma more recently in the past number of years. But certainly, I know there are other colleagues on the call that are working in this area, and that the research fatigue is real, particularly if you're not seeing substantial change on the ground. And as Martin said, the policy vacuum in terms of implementation. Um, the other key challenge for us as an organisation is who sets the research agenda. As I said, often researchers will come to us, they've already passed their ethics approval from research institutions, they've already received funding, and then they'll come to us and say, will you help us? Will you work with us? And we're saying, actually, we would rather be included from the outset, so inclusion by design rather than exclusion by accident. So, whose interest and then who sets that research agenda? Is it the funding body? Is it the researcher's own interest? Is it the institution or is it the community themselves? Again, this focus, particularly intense focus on peer researchers, PPI, which is public patient engagement or interaction, a real focus now on lived experience, which is hugely important to us. But actually, we are also seeing where there's gaps. There's a need to look at structural and systemic and institutions in terms of what's going on there, what's happening in the mainstream, and those in power. Because if we only look at those, if we only look at travellers, Roma and other marginalised groups, we're missing a whole, I suppose, structural analysis around power and around, how that's played out in people's lived experience and lived lives. Um, the other key challenge, I think, for the community sector overall is intellectual property. So if we're commissioning research from an institution or if researchers are coming to us and saying, we want to work with you, who owns that research? How does it get interpreted? How is it disseminated? So there is a real challenge around intellectual property and more increasingly institutions holding intellectual property in terms of research. And that has issues in terms of how things are interpreted, as I said, and misinterpreted. And then the other issue, and I know that those in anthropology in the 80s, and I'd say also broadly in the community sector, this crisis of representation, research isn't neutral. So what gets said, what gets interpreted, what gets put out there, what ends up in a headline in a newspaper is hugely important. And for us, we would see ourselves in terms of engage from the research perspective from the beginning to the end, so that we're constantly challenging ourselves around the analysis and around how things are being perceived. Um, Just a note on ethics, because it's hugely important, but often when you're talking to institutions, it's more of a tick box exercise. Like we'll go through the ethics committee and we'll tick all these boxes, but actually we're saying, research design is hugely important, how to protect participants, but actually it's the writing up, it's the analysis, and it's what gets said at the end of the day. The things that are said about travellers and continuously said about travellers by researchers, when done poorly is appalling. And this is just a quote, this is from the National Geographic. People writing things, and particularly in this quote, travellers in a parallel world where gender, roles, and itinerant lifestyle. Now, this is only 10 years ago. Um, but that researchers increasingly will come and they'll hike up on a site and engage with the local community without the local travel organisation involved, and then yet write in beautiful publications, but put messaging out there that's actually inaccurate, it's offensive, and I would arguably say it's deeply racist, in terms of what's being put out there. And it mightn't have been the intention of the researcher, but at the end of the day, this is what gets picked up. And this is what we're saying in terms of it has a huge value in terms of how policies are made, how policymakers perceive things. And again, some of the pictures that are depict, traveller lifestyle is appalling. And this isn't years ago, this is quite recent. And these are just quotes, I suppose, from travellers, just in terms of the analysis, around travellers being used and abused within research context, and things that are being written about travellers, particularly in terms of people's lives and people's experience. And the voyeuristic approach of researchers. And like what we'd say is that research done badly is bad, but actually research done well can have a huge impact in supporting those key issues around human rights. So just with that said, as Kira said, look, we've worked in this area for 40 years, but I'd say over the past 15 years, we've really looked at our own processes and our own approaches. And last year we published our research guidelines, which we think could be used not only in terms of traveller and Roma research, but has wider application for community development and other groups. So we'll just take you through the guidelines, and then what we'll do is we might park it there so people, if you have questions, just because we're conscious we were talking a lot. So I'll pass you on to Martin to take you through just the key dimensions of the research guidelines, which will circulate afterwards. And then we'll just leave with a few concluding comments, and then we'll go into discussion if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Lynsey. Just in terms of the research guidelines, as I said earlier on, they were in the making for a long period of time. And the context here was that Pavee Point, but also many other travel organisations and indeed groups working with Roma were inundated with requests to take part, participate, or partner up with different types of research. And it was felt that we needed to have some sort of guidelines, criteria that were ethical in nature, so we could make decisions on when, who, and how we engage on research. So that's a little bit, that's just a little bit of the context as to why the research guidelines were put together. But anyway, we call it the Pavee ethical approach. And number one there is the planning, is clarifying the purpose. And when these research guidelines were being drafted, one of the questions that I and others were pushing very strongly, the first question I would always ask if we get a request to partner or participate in a research project is why? I mean, for me, why? And if that can't be answered, satisfactorily, well, then it ends there for me. Why? It's a very simple question, actually, and as I said, if it's not answered properly or satisfactorily, then it ends, the process ends there. So, who benefits? Whose agenda is it? Is it serving the agenda and the needs of the community, in this case, travellers and Roma? Is it serving exclusively the agenda and the advancement of the career of the researcher or the institution they come from? If they do come from one, they don't always come from an institution. But we need to look at agendas and whose agendas is getting served here. Has it been done before? I mean, you need to avoid repetition, obviously. It's a waste of time and resources. Is there a new perspective, a new dimension if something similar has been done before? And what's the added value? And then, of course, other risks are intersectionality, it's about social justice and addressing racism. Then number two, the process and partnership. It has to be based on mutual respect. It has to be based on equality, parity of esteem with organisations and groups working with travellers and Roma. That we're not, that we're an equal partner in the process if we do decide to engage, that is. Culturally appropriate methods around language, literacy, not always having very formal, rigid structures and processes, because I've always said we as travellers, and maybe Rome as well, are actually very informal people. And, we're not, in terms of structures it's not a thing for us, as it were. So flexibility in terms of the approach is important. And then, yeah, we obviously said around ethics and ownership, the final product, the final piece of research, where does it lie? Who owns it? Does the community have ownership of it? And then, the same organizations having a say around the dissemination of the final product. But there's also a bit there around, in terms of ownership, the only way that can be secured or can be achieved is through that co-decision process, is that inclusive community engagement process, from the beginning, the middle, and the end, collecting the information, analysing the information, and influencing the recommendations and the outcomes of that piece of research. That's the only way you can create a sense of ownership, within the community. So participation, obviously, involving the organisations and groups working with Roma at all stages, as I've just said. Support co-researchers and community researchers to avoid tokenism or tick box. Well, yeah, we had travellers and Roma involved, but was it real meaningful participation based on equality, respect, and parity of esteem? So these kind of issues, need to be kept in check at all times, because they're not events. It's an ongoing process. And then obviously the other one is, adequate resources and having the time. And then also at any stage, if you feel uncomfortable with how the direction that the research project has taken, that you have the right to withdraw from the process. Another bit there, and I mentioned this at a launch recently of a report from FRA, which is the Fundamental Rights Agency. And, in terms of travellers as, community researchers and peer researchers, and that is important, and that will always need to be a feature of any research project. But I was making a point also at the launch that I think we, and Pavee Point certainly is very ambitious in this regard, that we need to create the conditions where travellers and Roma themselves become fully fledged qualified researchers. So we're not always peer researchers or community researchers. And, and that's the ambition Pavee Point has, and we'll be certainly looking at how that might happen over the next while. And the issue there is, of course, that like individuals from these communities, not just travellers and Roma, but indeed other Indigenous groups, and it has happened in the past, they could actually themselves conduct research that maybe could be argued is unethical and damaging. And these guidelines need to apply equally in that context as they do to non-travellers, But I suppose the point here is we've never were in a position to make those mistakes when it comes to research. And that's the point. We need to get to the stage where we are in that position. And I'm sure we will make mistakes, but it's the principle really that I'm trying to get at. And then the number four, as positioning, and as Lynsey has always said, none of us are value free. We carry a set of values and belief systems, and either consciously or subconsciously, it gets played out in how we relate to people, how we interact with people, particularly people from minority groups, marginalized groups, oppressed groups. That creates its own dynamic. So there's a bit there about keeping that in check, maybe a bit of training, anti-racism training, and other types of support. Power imbalances. Obviously, not by and large at this stage exclusively. I think I'm correct in saying, Lynsey, that any research that's been undertaken has been done or led out by settled people. Whether it doesn't matter whether from Ireland or England or America or Australia, whatever it is. And with that comes a whole set of issues that need to be watched. As it says, values and belief systems, power imbalances, because there is a history. There's a history there that can't be ignored in terms of unequal power relationships, and settled people in various contexts are seen as part of being the colonizer, being the oppressor, and obviously minorities, and in this case, Travis and Roma being the oppressed. But so there's a long history there that creates its own dynamic that we all need to be very cognizant of and be very careful in terms of how it's managed. And then I think we said the other bit, it's an anti-racist, inclusive, community engagement process, and that the community, is not just informed of the analysis, but actually develop the analysis from the research and key recommendations. And then the fifth pillar that's in the guidelines, as you can see there, and again, it's a bit repetitive, but dignity, respects, and make sure there's accuracy. Avoid deficit framing, stereotypes, reinforcing prejudice, sensationalism, voyeurism, as Lynsey has said, and then also ensuring that the output, is accessible, is easy to understand and read and make sense of for the whole community. Because there will be some in the community where language, and literacy will be an issue. So it's about making sure that the output is as accessible as possible. So that's you, Lynsey.
Yeah, and I suppose we didn't mention about the guidelines. It's a checklist, so we'll circulate it. But I suppose we developed them with the idea in mind that it could be a checklist for people, so that you could check if you were engaging with research. But I suppose as those that are working in the community sector, research is often inflicted on us. Do you know what I mean, in terms of adding to our already stretched workloads? And one of the key, I suppose, dimensions in the research guidelines is that organizations that are contributing and participating and engaging research need to be resourced to do so. That it's an add-on to all of our jobs, and in order to, I suppose, support the broader issue of parity of esteem, that we as those working in the community sector need to be resourced to be able to do it adequately too. So it was just another key issue that we've always highlighted. So just in terms of key messages, as we said, look, the research agenda should be set by the community. It should be grounded in what are the current issues, that are coming up on the ground for the people that we're working with. And, that the ethics piece is beyond the tick box exercise, and it needs to, I suppose, be included and grounded in how we write, how we analyze, how we interrogate data, and how we present data at the end of the day. That, as Martin said, look, that there's a need to reaffirm an anti-racist approach to research, that it's not neutral, and that it's rooted in community development approaches, and that that it should be have collective benefit of the community, not just individuals, or not just the individual researcher or individuals within the community. Partnership and participation are essential, but there's limitations to participation too. I mean, we're also quite realistic, is that, when there are research projects that come to us, we do have to make the assessment of whether or not we can be fully engaged, partially engaged, or not engaged at all. So, we're not always purist about the approaches, but that the fundamental core values and fundamental principles around the research must be core to any of the research that we engage with. The output should inform policy change and collective action, and that the research should go back to the community. So like any of the research that we do, you'll have your nice glossy report, but that we also are cognizant that we need to be able to present the findings back in a way that's relatable to everybody, including travellers. So, using different ways or different dissemination points is fundamental to the work. We'd say that, look, research is only one tool, that there's many tools. It's not the only tool, but it's one important tool that can be used to protect, and in the struggle to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. It's of huge value. And, and I think that's the point that we always make, is that, it has a huge I suppose, impact on how policies are made, how it affects people in their everyday lives. So it should be treated, with the seriousness that it has. Um, And then the last thing to say is that, and I think Martin said it at the beginning, like we've always been engaged with research. So any of the data that you saw, we would have been directly involved in, I suppose, supporting that data collection, the analysis, but not just Pavee Point, local travel organisations on the ground, and in particular traveller workers and groups working with Roma are core and central to not only data collection, but also in terms of informing the analysis. That takes time, it takes graft, it takes energy, and I suppose it can't be done without the local travel organisations and groups working with Rome on the ground. So it's just to acknowledge that work and that it doesn't start only with data collection. It is part and parcel of the analysis of the write-up and of the dissemination. So that was just one of our more recent publications with the European Fundamental Rights Agency. So we might leave it there, park it there. If people have questions or if people want to discuss a bit further, we're happy to do so.
Thanks very much, Lynsey and Martin. That was so comprehensive. Taking in, the context of travellers in Roma in Ireland and what the challenges and issues that are being faced by the community, as well as the journey Pavee Point has been on and how research fits in and has grown from that journey and contributes to that journey. So we'd love to open the floor now and invite some questions. And Mark, you're straight up there, hand in straight away, which we're delighted to see. You're very welcome. So maybe you could just briefly introduce yourself. I know you did in the chat, and then share your question as well. So that'd be great.
Yeah, hi everybody. Apologies, I'm suffering a little bit with this kind of cold for the second time that's been going around the place, but so my voice isn't usually quite so gravelly. So I'm Mark. I lecture in the community education at the University of West of Scotland, and I've been lucky enough to be involved with the IACD and working in community development. I was originally born in Belfast, but my parents dragged me away to Scotland when I was 3, so I'm still trying to make my way home. But I was fortunate enough to visit Maynooth and meet representatives from Pavee Point some time ago when I was doing some work with the CLD Standards Council here. And the work that's been done in Ireland is always an absolute inspiration to me. So it's been a great opportunity to come and hear that amazing work. So my question, and this relates to the broader sense of probably where I am in my practice and where we are in this kind of ongoing fight against fascism, is that how are we fundamentally transforming things? This process of research can do so much to try and give a voice and try and give a highlight. But at the bottom line, it's certainly in my practice in Scotland, there's a lot of talk about consultation, there's a lot of talk about co-production, there's a lot of talk about participatory budgeting, etc. But these are in communities that just get poorer and poorer and suffer the violence over and over again. And I'm simply, to use that Angela Davis quote, no longer willing to accept what I cannot change, but have to change what I cannot accept. And just to offer that, because I know it's a kind of it is a challenge. Last night I was on a webinar, a couple of resources here. So there's a new book called Escape from Capitalism by an Italian American economist, brilliant writer. But she actually talks about Ireland and things like that, and how about capitalism comes about, and the colonial powers of the English over Ireland, etc. And then I've also included the kind of recent report from Oxfam, Resisting the Rule of the Rich, because we are, with the massively increasing levels of wealth and therefore power inequalities, it feels to me like there's kind of beginning to be a growing recognition that we cannot sustain this level of kind of structural violence for many, many reasons. So sorry for the long question, but thank you for a brilliant presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Lynsey or Martin, do you want to respond? And thanks for putting those resources into the chat, Mark. I think that's really useful.
Mark, I'm not really quite sure if I got the gist of the question, but anyway, if I'm off the mark, forgive me. But I think I might understand. You can't speak about poverty and not speak about wealth and wealth distribution. and how wealth is accumulated and how wealth is distributed. And it's the very same. I mean, I think it's the same globally. The system is stacked in favor of those who are wealthy and getting wealthier. The tax system and the loopholes and tax breaks, and the poor are poor and maybe getting poorer. And certainly that was the result of, of structural inbuilt inequalities, and who gets to make those decisions around wealth distribution and the tax breaks. It's always, those who you might describe as the powerful, the elite, the privileged, serving other elite and privileged people, and the poor and marginalised groups, feeling the brunt of that. But like what you might have in Scotland, we do have a whole range of policies in place to try and mitigate that. And you can question whether or not they're effective or not. So we have anti-poverty strategies, we have poverty proofing, we have equality proofing policies. So whenever government or state agencies are making decisions, they have to look at it from these perspectives to make sure whatever decisions they're making doesn't disproportionately adversely affect or make worse the situation, in this case Travers and Roma, but indeed other communities. But again, going back to the point we made earlier on, it's about more robust, vigorous implementation of those commitments around equality proofing, poverty proofing, gender proofing. I mean, you're all familiar with this, and I think you have them in Scotland as well, if I'm not mistaken. But it's I think it's really important that we stay as much as we can motivated. Because I'm 40 odd year now here, and other people have been around a good while. I mean, if you felt you weren't making a difference, or you weren't having an impact, I mean, honestly, you just wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. You wouldn't. So you have to be. And I actually, in an Irish context, and I'm sorry for this long-winded response, Mark, but people who know me know I do tend to be long-winded. But there is some discernible change here for Travers and Roma as well. And that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me motivated. I mean, not as much change or progress as you would like, but there has been incremental progress and change on some issues. And, that just serves to motivate me and my colleagues to keep on going.
But could I just pick up on the other bit? And I think the question you were saying too is, how can research be used to fight fascism and racism and all of that? I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing, which is being used quite smartly by those on the far right, is that they're using data as pinch points in terms of reinforcing racism and discrimination. So say, for instance, any of the discourse around migrants, so it has this kind of alertism, X amount of people in the country. And actually, as community workers and as those working in research, we also have the duty to, I suppose, challenge that with the data that we know, and also, I suppose, to have an informed debate, because it's quite easy to throw stats without any context. But, it's much harder to engage in a more, I suppose, informed dialogue. And I think that's a bit, I think that we often are feel challenged ourselves. How do we make our messaging points as informative and as, I suppose, as engaged as those that seek to undermine the work that's being done on the ground? But the other thing that Martin's saying is that we can see discernible progress in some areas, and that's because of research. So if we look at, say, even health inequalities or educational inequalities for travellers, we could see within a 30-year period there has been marginal improvements. And it's very easy to say, well, nothing has changed. But actually, if you're looking at the data, if you're looking at an informed analysis, you can see there has been marginal improvements. And it is about, I suppose, saying, right, that's our starting point. This is where we're at, and this is where we need to go. So it is a useful tool. But I think as community workers, we need to get smart around the messaging and around combating some of that really, frightful data that the far right are using, but also quite, I suppose it's, it's salacious, but it's also key to their overall achievement of trying to undermine progress.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, just picking up on that point as well, while Lynsey was speaking, she actually reminded me of it. One of the big concerns we have at the moment, and it's actually quite scary, is that there are, when it comes to the far right and their reach into certain, communities, especially disadvantaged communities who are angry and frustrated and have every right to be angry and frustrated, feeling left behind. Well, they have a reach as well into our own community. And unfortunately, there's been some travellers who have been, how would you say, indoctrinated into their agenda. And I know some travellers who have actually taken part in anti-migrant protests and demonstrations. Excuse my language. And, it really is frightening, to see that level of influence and reach into our community, buying into their propaganda. Oh, well, you're our own indigenous community, you're more Irish than the Irish, and we need to be looking after you. Well, I've always said, well, you've had 1,500 years to look after us, and you need to do a better job. But anyway, the point is that that's a bit a challenge for Pavee Point and other travel organisations, is that worrying trend of travellers being indoctrinated into the propaganda of the far right.
Thanks very much, Martin and Lynsey. Hannah, would you like to join the conversation?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. That was just brilliant and fascinating and really, really useful. I was just wondering about the point on, so currently I'm working on a project alongside some Scottish travellers, and it's kind of come out of lots of conversations and long-term relationships, and kind of they've chosen the subject and everything. And we've got some funding for 6 peer researchers. And I was just really interested in if you had any advice on how to really make the most of that opportunity to enable people to kind of build their career if they wanted to, in terms of becoming researchers or community development workers. Like, how can I make, as a community development worker and someone who's working alongside them on research, have you got any advice on just how to just make the most of this particular project and this particular opportunity, in terms of looking to the future, and yeah, just really wanting people to be able to build their careers if that's what they want to do.
I have a few thoughts, but you might pick up on that. I mean, I think for us, it's that you're taking people through the whole research process, because often, we talk about peer researchers. It's generally researchers coming in saying, right, I need X amount of travellers to go out and collect data about travellers or Roma or whatever. So what we always do here is that from the research design perspective. So obviously you've identified your research question, but there's obviously training involved around the research in terms of collecting that data. But it's also, I suppose, ensuring that peer researchers or community researchers, have a say in how the research is undertaken and the most appropriate methods. So you might think it's interviews, but actually it might be more appropriate as a focus group. And then also I think
Just to say we are doing all of that, definitely.
Yeah.
This is more just thinking how, among all of that and involving them from the beginning of the process, how could we help them to think about longer term career for themselves?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a multitude of ways. I mean, I think if people are interested in research, it's just harnessing that interest, and then others mightn't,
You just plant the me is actually quite simple. Now I'm putting myself under pressure. You just plant the seed, you plant the notion, because normally people will not go outside their lived experience. And sometimes it actually does take people outside of the community to put on the table there are other possibilities, there are other options. I'm going to give you an example. I was a youth worker in Pavee Point for a long number of years, and we had a young men's group. When I say young travel men's group, I'm talking about 14, 15, 16 years of age. Okay, and we'd have activities once a week. But I remember having a bit of a brainstorming session with them about what they'd like to do, what would like to see on the program over the winter months. And it was quite interesting, actually, because they just spoke about football, playing pool, but they never spoke about orienteering or any other kind of, kayaking or whatever it might be. They didn't go outside the lived experience. So sometimes you have to facilitate a discussion where force people to think outside the box, that there are other possibilities, there are other options. Because if you're coming from an excluded, oppressed minority, you can be conditioned to think this is your lot in life.
Mm.
Like if it wasn't for John and Ronnie back in 1985, I didn't even know the terminology youth work or community work until they told me what it was and what it meant, and the principles involved in community work and community development and youth work. So as I said earlier on, it's not an event. It's a process. It's an ongoing process of being politicized, consciousness raising, knowing and realizing there are other possibilities for you, whether that's as a researcher, whether it's as a community worker or a youth worker. And if I didn't have people back in the early days like John and Ronnie, I wouldn't be in Pavee Point today. And a lot of other travellers are in a very similar situation. So I just think it's about having that discussion and talking about these possibilities. And the more you talk about them, the more you reinforce them. There could be one or two in that group who might say, yep, that could be for me.
But I also think the important point there is that, just because they're of the community in terms of research, that doesn't mean they become marginalized in terms of only researching within the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's thinking beyond. So if you're trying to plant a seed around research, well, that doesn't mean you'll be researching your own families, your own community forever. So it's about seeing what's possible outside of that.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes people get challenged because they think that they have to go out constantly to their own communities asking the same questions, and they get the flack for it. I get to go home, but but people that are living in and amongst the community, they have to go and see their families and their community and saying what has changed. So I think there's a bit where we also have to be careful around
the language as well. I remember years ago, Davy Joyce, as far as he's the first self-identified traveller to become a barrister. And it was a big deal, a big achievement. And it was quite interesting how both travellers and non-travellers actually, how they were describing him. Traveller barrister.
Yeah.
Now, he's not a traveller barrister. He's a barrister who happens to be a traveller.
Yeah.
So that's just the point that what Lynsey's making a really important point there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's so useful. Thank you.
I might just add a couple of things to it as well. I think it's really important that, and Lynsey mentioned this earlier on, I think around payment, that the payment structure is reflective of the work that people are doing and on a par with other researchers when people are employed initially as community researchers or peer researchers. And sometimes that needs to happen in the community organisations and outside of universities where pay for research assistance can be quite low. Then training, which you're doing as part of the project, is also obviously really important, but with an emphasis or focus on transferable skills. And that's maybe where you can have some of the conversations about what other opportunities there might be. And then real opportunities for other kinds of training outside of the project, which might lead to also not just specific training, but more educational opportunities, and creating the conditions for people to grow into those opportunities, whether it's with local colleges or eventually maybe, towards a degree, if that's what people are interested in. And I think the points that people have made about not only research in your own community, or else not only community working in your own community are also true, because in some of the projects we've been working on, people have gone on to be employed in Pavee Point and then have gone on to be employed elsewhere also, or gone on to do degrees in community work, but also in other areas. So mentoring is a really core part of that, and the community worker can take a role in that. And then I think as well within the project that people are visible and have opportunities for connecting outside, so when it comes to the dissemination side of the project with the public facing piece, that people who've been involved in the research get that profile, get that experience, go to the policy committees if there's presentations to be made, go to the Oireachtas, go wherever, and that the partnership that starts with the research design and the research question continues right through the publication. Authorship is another really important point. If people are going to progress into whatever career, being a named author, and I mean, it goes without saying, I think, and we're in this space, but it really doesn't always happen. And so there's a whole other set of sharing power right through the whole of the process, and then supporting people into following their dreams, dream big beyond the project. So
thank you, that's great.
Thanks.
Ciara,
yeah,
if you don't mind, can I just give you two practical examples of research? I think it might help illustrate in a very tangible way what we're talking about here. I'll give you a really good one, Well, I suppose it's, well, anyway, and one really bad one. Anyway,
Okay.
back in 1987, there was a group of academics, health experts, and it's in the public domain, so I can mention it was Joe Barry and others. It's in the public domain. They did a piece of research and published a report called "The Health Status of the Traveller Community." I hope I got the title right. Yeah. Anyway, and actually, I think it might have been the first in the country looking at the health status of travellers. But anyway, between the jigs and the reels, it was a group of privileged middle class settled people who quite clearly brought their own cultural bias and ethnocentric view of the world to it, because their concluding observation was to improve travellers' health, they need to move out of trailers, move out of, better known as caravans to settle people, move out of trailers into houses. So quite clearly there was a cultural bias there, very, as I say, ethnocentric. Then there was a little one which I said was very good, and then I kind of put back a little bit because I do have a little slight concern about it. I feel uncomfortable with the notion of researchers, anthropologists and sociologists and whatever, wanting to live with travellers, wanting to live for 3 days, a week, 2 weeks. I just find that really, really uncomfortable. I don't like it. I think it's an invasion of people's privacy, and all the rest of it. And it's just something really unethical about that, in my opinion. I think you can collect the information by other means. You don't have to live in a trailer in the site with travellers. And that has happened a fair bit. But anyway, the one I'm getting to, which is, I was going to say very good. It's good. It's good. I take the very bit out. Okay. It was interesting because many older travellers, including my own father, Lord rest him, when we were primarily nomadic people at one stage in our history and travelling all around the country, a lot of travellers had looked at the past, what you might describe as rose-tinted glasses. And they say, oh, well, things were different. We were happier. We had a very good relationship with the settled community and primarily the farmers in mending their pots and their pans and picking their spuds. And I have no doubt there was some good relationships. I have no doubt about that, right? But this woman, Jane Heliner, who was a Canadian sociologist, anthropologist, she lived with travellers down in Galway for a period of time. I forget exactly how long. But anyway, she looked at the experience of travellers, I think it was between 1939 and 1959. And this was around 86, 87 when she went to live with the travellers in Galway. And she did a piece of research by studying newspaper articles, court judgments, minutes of council meetings, right? And her conclusion was that in that time period, 1939 to 1959, there was a lot of racism. There was a lot of evictions taking place. Travellers being moved from camp to camp, not being served in shops, not being served in pubs, not getting jobs. And there was even 1 or 2 deaths. Travellers who had horses out in the farmers' fields. I remember one case quite distinctly, actually. It was a ward man down in Athlone. A farmer came down and shot him dead at the fire. So that was very useful data, because it even contradicts what some of the older travellers were saying when they look at the past. Things were better, much more positive. But the evidence tells us differently. So her research was really interesting and very useful, but not living with travellers. No way.
Thanks, Martin. Really interesting. And you're right. I think that telling the story of the project really actually illuminates some of the challenges and issues, as well as some of the quality points. Anna, I think you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting and thought-provoking presentation and conversation as well. And I'm very fortunate in that I have a hard copy of the guidelines from December, so been thumbing through it quite a bit. And I suppose there's a bit of an observation and a question, and I'll try and not make it too long-winded. But what I was really struck about in terms of your input and also in looking at the guidelines is that often guidelines for research, even research that is, community-based or participatory, the guidelines can often still be quite generalised in terms of the principles and how they're worded. And what I've noticed and seen from these guidelines is that they're kind of anything but generalized. They are really specific. And I think that is very, very helpful. So just to, for anybody who's not had the chance to sort of drill into them, the questions that you have in those, under those different headings, participation, planning, and so on, they're really pointed questions. And one of them particularly, and you'd highlighted this, Lynsey, in when you were speaking about, who benefits from the research. And that could be a generalized kind of, principle. Who benefits? Does the community benefit? But you're actually saying in your guidelines, is this serving the needs of the traveller and Roma community? Which makes it far more specific and pointed a question. And then the other example that I had pulled out that I thought was a really powerful question. I can't remember which category it was under now, but is the process of the research anti-extractivist at all times? Again, really pointed, specific questions that anybody doing this research that's involving the traveller and Roma community has got to ask themselves and also consider in terms of the research alongside the grouping of people that's involved in carrying that out, and obviously ideally that's including traveller and Roma communities from the starting point. But you had talked about using the guidelines you talked about, you commission research directly, you participate in research, you contribute to research. So there's a variety of ways in which that might happen. And I kind of just was really curious as to how the guidelines go down with others. And they're, relatively recent in terms of publication, but those principles are born out of decades of experience. So when somebody does approach you, or a team of people approach you, and they're asking those questions like, we'd really like to get the involvement or the input, the experience of people from the traveller and Roma community. Just how are these guidelines being received? And do you find people actually kind of getting pulled up sharp and taken aback? And if that's the case, then they're obviously really hitting the mark. But I was just curious about that, because it's one thing having the guidelines that you use to shape your own research.
Yeah.
But when others are going, oh, we want to do this and, want to make, and then you're going, right, okay, well, have a look at this and just tell us if it's, if your research idea is it's informed by these kinds of principles and guidelines. How's that going down?
I think it's a good litmus test in terms of how people perceive partnership. So just to take you back, we, as a research advisory group, we were established a number of years ago, but we were getting requests, anyone data, particularly around thesis time for students. We want to talk to travellers about X, or we want, so we put in a process around, we have a questionnaire that generally any researchers that we would consider even engaging with, they would have to fill out based on this checklist. And actually, it's a good gauge of whether or not people are actually serious, because if you're serious, you'll fill it out and then we can consider it. But oftentimes not, people look at it and they don't want to bother. Yeah. So it shows us, who is really, really serious. But internally within the organisation, we've also, I suppose, a process, and we've agreed process around research we will engage with and research we won't. So for undergrad research, we don't. Master's research, we don't. And then there's a tiered process around the questions. So even for us, because I suppose the other challenge for us is lots of staff in the organisation were being approached individually. Well, I know Martin, so I'm going to interview him about whatever. And it was also awkward for staff to say, well, I can't. So it was also to protect staff's time. And also to support some of the local travel organisations who felt like they couldn't say no because they had good relationships. But it is, I think for us, it's a good way of weeding out people who were actually quite serious and committed. And then I think also from researchers, sometimes when they fill out the form, and we can share it with people, they're also, I suppose, it also puts a bit of more structure in terms of what they're looking for, and also makes them think a bit more. But we do get resistance in terms of some researchers saying, well, why would I fill that out? Or, it's for the benefit of ye, not for us. And we're saying, well, if it is for the benefit of travellers, then there should be no issue in terms of to articulate yourself,
Totally. Yeah.
I would say when we do get requests to engage with research and all the rest of it, honest to God, like there's a kind of an expectation. Will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that saying no is not an option. And I think that's because there has been a long history of travel organisations tending to respond in the positive, and so there is that expectation, and then there's a huge disappointment when we say no, so that actually speaks volumes for a lot of other issues that travel to serve as academia and researchers. It's actually quite insulting in some ways. There is that that expectation.
But I also think where the sticky point that we're seeing more frequently is that at the point of publication, if we have issues, even in terms of analysis or how things are disseminated, if you're going to a conference, if our name is on it, we should be informed. We should be part of that process. Whereas I think academics often in institutions say, well, no, that's my work. And we're saying, no, we fed into it. We've contributed. We're partners. So, we need to make sure that that's meaningful. And sometimes that's a challenge, and it's also checking, I suppose, I think Ciara said earlier, that parity of esteem. If you were really serious about undertaking partnership working, but that means right through the process, not just at the beginning, so it can be challenging, as Mark was saying. Sometimes we have very difficult conversations with researchers, but like it is for us, it's a healthy dialogue to have,
There was a situation a couple of years ago where we were approached and we decided, no, we're not touching this with a barge pole. But the person, and this is hard to manage, maybe even impossible, the guy then went somewhere else, went outside Pavee and went directly to the community. And the community took him into the site, gave him a trailer that he lived on the site for 3 months while he was doing his research and his photography. And the end product was absolutely stereotypical bullshit, quite damaging. So he didn't get what he was looking for in terms of cooperation and permission from Pavee Point. He circumvented Pavee Point, went directly to community, and that's the bit that's hard to manage.
Well, thank you.
Thanks. Sarah.
Thank you very much for that. It's very, very impressive the way you have really taken control over researchers approaching your community, which I guess you've had to for all the reasons that you've said. You've really been pushed into doing that. And I guess my point relates to what you've just been talking about. I wonder to what extent you find the whole community has bought into this process, and what your steps you might take next to kind of bring everybody in so that everybody owns the process and they're not going to let people in by the back door. I was particularly struck recently by a colleague from India who's been working with groups of marginalized people in India, sex workers, for example, to set up community research ethics committees, which is kind of what you've got. Only maybe you haven't quite called it that, or maybe you do. But it's and I'm in two minds about it, because there's a danger that it then just mimics the institutional research ethics review boards, and the volunteers and community-based researchers who become part of that ethics board or ethics review process take on board the ethics of the academics, or in India, the sort of colonial attitudes, the extractivist attitudes or whatever. But I was just wondering, now this is in place, you've got the guidelines in place, are there some next steps to make it even more powerful and to influence perhaps more people in your own community to take it on board?
Yes.
Good question.
It's a really, really good question, because we have a number of target audiences. I mean, one of the key areas that we would like to engage with, and we have over the past number of years, is research ethic committees directly. Because in Ireland and probably in other countries, travellers and Roma are considered the highest tier in terms of applying for ethics. I think it's tier 4 or whatever. But part of applying, and as I said, people apply for research ethics and then they come to us. So they've already been approved by an institution that hasn't engaged directly with travel organisations. So part of what we would like is that at an institution level, that direct engagement with travel organisations should be core if you're going to be undertaking research within the community. A bit like Athena Swan, which is limited, but that if you're applying for public funding to undertake research, you should also engage with these particular research guidelines and also engage with local and national travel organisations if you're going to be seeking to carry out research within the community. And that should be core. I mean, that's what's happened with Athena Swan. You have to consider gender when you're applying for any research funding in Ireland and other jurisdictions. And then more broadly, part of what we are looking to do is also support local travel organisations and groups working with Roma, because as Martin said, local organisations are inundated with requests and sometimes feel like they can't say no, because I suppose it's exposure on one hand in terms of saying, look, these are the areas that we're really interested in, but also there's limitations to some of that. So we're undertaking kind of a two-pronged approach in terms of engaging directly with the research community, whether that's institutions, and then also within traveller and Roma organisations around supporting capacity there, because there's really good capacity within some of the organisations, but some are limited. So it's about trying to support that on a broader level. So that is kind of our key focus over the next while. And then looking at the bigger research funding bodies, Research Ireland, in terms of their own practice. So we're going to be taking a mainstreaming and targeted approach to that.
And I think another dimension of it too is community workers. One thing that struck me, Lynsey and Martin, when you were talking, was the amount of work that community workers in organisations, in like your own, but in others across the country, in different spaces, that are contributing to research, and then that work is often invisibilised. And so I think there's another piece for educators of community workers to educate community workers to also, in their space, take power around research and not shy away from it, and not I suppose, be intimidated by the process, understand how it shapes the work, the context, the policy context, the practice context, and to actively kind of engage in the way you guys have in Pavee Point.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that is all of the hands that were up. Was there anyone else who'd like to ask a question or say anything? There's a comment in here from Liz saying thanks for the informative event, and she has to leave. And there was a number of comments from people along the way. John Cornell and Mark Langton had to leave, and Barbara. But it is being recorded, so I'm sure people will go back and have a look later. Thank you both so much for taking the time. It's a lot of time that you've spent with us, but it's been really informative, and I think people will engage with the recording, and it's great to build on these conversations from India to Australia, now to Ireland, and hopefully next time to Canada, and we'll confirm the date and time for that in the next week or so, for all of those who are subscribed to IACD, and get some information out. But it's really good to see these conversations happening in parallel and also with each other in this space. So thanks to IACD for creating the space for all of us from all around the world who are interested in rights-based research and community development and research to come together to have these conversations. And thanks to Lynsey and Martin for joining us today. Sarah or Anna, would you like to say anything before we finish up? No?
Just a big thank you. I think that was really great, and it's so impressive. I can see how you've developed this over time. It's a massive amount of work, but really, really well considered, as Anna said. And if you don't mind, I'll pass it on to the colleague in India, Pradeep Narayanan, who works with Praxis, because they've been doing this work, as I said, on developing community-based research ethics boards, which is not quite the same, but similar idea really, as a gatekeepers to keep some researchers out or to improve the quality of the research. And so he's been looking for people around the world who are doing similar things. So I think you might be interested. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, have a lovely afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, a
Or
big
wherever
thank you
time
for
it is.
me as well. And if it's okay, Martin and Lynsey, we'd be delighted to share the guidelines with our members through the website and social media as well. It's a fabulous resource and really accessible as well. So if that's okay with yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to say, I don't know if we said it from the beginning, but they were developed in partnership with the Department of Applied Social Studies, and in particular with Kira and other colleagues there. So we'll send those on to you, obviously, and the slides, but just to acknowledge the work of the Department of Applied Social Studies and Maynooth University also.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Our pleasure, and thank you. Thanks for today. Okay, thanks
You're
everyone.
welcome. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.